Welcome to Thoughts and Discourses on Digital Transformation. Dive into a world of insightful conversations and profound ideas. Join us as we explore the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities in the digital age. Stay tuned for engaging discussions and expert opinions that will inspire and inform.
Okay, so here's another set of videos on 10-minute videos on thoughts and discourses. And this time I have the great pleasure of introducing Sal. I've worked with Sal for, it's going to be like 15 years when we were at the Fed. Sal was critical in implementing some of the DevOps practices that actually for New York Fed, but actually got rolled out across the whole Federal Reserve System. So, Sal, you want to introduce yourself, and then we can have a discussion about what you're working on now.
Sure. So I'm Sal. I worked in finance for the first part of my career at the New York Stock Exchange, FINRA, and the Fed, and then spent 7 years at Google. I have some thoughts about the way you can do some context engineering to improve the quality of the spec coded apps, as well as some thoughts about how context engineering could provide a good baseline for analysts as others, as well as other business users, using LLMs to maximize their ability to produce good quality content and to produce good production-worthy workflows.
So do you want to maybe talk through a little bit about what you mean by context engineering, and then we can talk about what you're doing with spec coding and what you mean by spec coding. So let's talk about context engineering and your definition about that.
So let's take a brief moment to think about what does an LLM do to build a context, right? So when you're asking the questions, you're asking it in a certain thing called a context, right? So there's a whole set of static filters that go through when you ask a question. The static filters and filter out things like, to make sure that you're not asking it to do something illegal or immoral, like, build a bomb or something. Then there's a whole set of dynamic filters, which tend to go and build out what exactly you're asking for and how it should start arranging things. And then it starts the tokenization process, right? And then it uses this particular thing to build a context, in which case now the LM generates its response based on where it is in that context and what is the most probable, probably what is closest to what you're asking for, like what is the most probabilistically true thing that you could be requesting. The thing to remember about the context windows, it's like working memory, right? And as you're working with the LM in that particular session, um, things can change about the context, right? So there are terms about context pollution, which is when it starts forgetting things get garbage collected. The joke I always make is that if you've ever misplaced your keys, you know what garbage collection is, right? Because your brain is doing that, right? It says, well, I'm already home. I don't need to have this reference to my keys. I could just discard that and, have room for cat memes, right? So it's kind of doing something similar to that. Things get dropped out of the context to make room for new content, right? And new tokenization. So that's kind of the thing that causes these things to degrade over your session, right? So if you've ever used it to go and try to generate code, you'll find that at first you have very detailed instructions on how to do
Yeah.
something. And then like the fifth, sixth, seventh, maybe 12th step, it decides, you know what? You don't need any security. I'm going to remove all of this stuff that you specified on using CRSF tokens. I'm going to discard that because I just lost it out of my context. Now I forgot that you wanted it to be secure. The thing with context engineering is the idea is that you set up your context to maximize the quality of the content. And because these particular context files have a higher priority in the system, they become basically the background in which the context behaves. So things don't get pushed out. So if you take care to go and specify, and again, every one of these engines seems to have a different way of doing things. So I'm going to speak mostly about Gemini because I've used it the most, and Claude because I've used it somewhat. And they all have these collections of files in a special directory where you define usually in Markdown or in plain text, sometimes in JSON or YAML, um, all of the standing instructions and what those instructions should apply to. If you go to my GitHub, I have an example of some spec. Yeah, so this is the Gemini file that I written out. I had looked at what other people have done in Claude, Cursor, and in GitHub Copilot, and I wrote out instructions on how I wanted to generate, and I basically asked Gemini to generate the app twice, once with context engineering and once without. When I did it with context engineering, um, I got a pretty much working application. There were two bugs in it that were quickly fixed by basically asking Gemini to fix the bug based on the error message. And
Right.
I got a working application. When I did it without context engineering, went through the prompt, I got basically a broken application. Um, I had went in there and started fixing it and asking Gemini to rerun things and so on. And I suffered what a lot of people suffer with is that the the LLM gets worse as you're using it. Um, and pretty soon it was like deleting things that I wanted it to keep. So I was using a package manager in a particular way. The package manager I was using is UV, which is quite useful if you're going to build out the Docker image for things. It does a pretty good job with that. It decided to delete that, even though I had requested it not delete it. Um, it moved files around without using Git commands because, again, it had forgotten the instructions to use Git when manipulating the file system.
So that's great. So you would expect every company to build out their own standardized Markdown file for their LLM. Is that right?
When you're doing spec programming, um, you should be outlining all the best practices for your tool chain. You should also be outlining not just the best practices for your tool chain, but your coding standards, like how you format code. Um, you should be explaining the rules for how you use your version control system. Um, if you have very specific rules about how you store data, you should be specifying those particular rules. You don't want your LLM generating code, which when it goes through the object relational mapping layer, it it insists on creating new tables or new indices. Um, that would be bad. Instead, specifying the rules for how it should be creating data or should be creating it all. Um, it should be using the standards that you guys use for your REST endpoints. If you have a
Right.
decoupled UI, it should not be dumping template files into the controller area. Um, all of these things are things that you can specify. I was joking, it's like when you're onboarding a new developer, these are the things you'd be telling a new developer, right? Like your
Right.
senior, one of your seniors would be sitting there mentoring them for the first 2 weeks. I mean, you watched me do this, I think, at the Fed once or twice. But you sit down with somebody and you explain to them, yeah, um, do it this way. We run things this way. This is the standard we use. Yeah, I know other people do it differently, but this is how we do it. And kind of like if you do it this way, you're going to get a lot more help because people are going to understand what you did.
Right.
Um,
So
and
it's practically you could do this for every project, slightly customized, whether it's a transactional project or a UI heavy project or a legacy project with different standards, right? Or even different languages, right?
yeah, so again, both Claude Code and Gemini have this idea that you can have a root instructions file, like these root context engineering files, and then individual project specific ones. So your root ones might have general instructions about how you guys actually do your work, how you outline, how you design your projects, how you arrange things, rules about data, rules about identifying PII, and then
And so you've broken this down into certain major areas: code structure and organization, coding style,
yeah, this is
packaging.
yeah. So the application I generated here was a library application. So everybody's familiar with the library. You check out books and so on. Um, so on my blog post, I have a description of the prompt. Right?
So here's the prompt up here, the prompt.
Yeah. Without context engineering, it did attempt to build this application, and after multiple steps, the context eventually got polluted, started making mistakes, and then it became more and more difficult to work. But with context engineering, it maintained things like use the package manager I requested.
Right.
It didn't violate any of the PEP 8 rules. Um, because my context engineering specified how to outlay the project, I didn't have this one big Python file with models and REST endpoints and models and validation code all in one file. For one thing, it helps you clarify. Like, I like the idea of your senior engineering team sitting in a room, one person driving at the keyboard, defining all of the rules that you want the LM to follow because these are the exact same rules that they follow. In some
Right.
cases, it's things they just do because they're best practices and they're seasoned engineers and they've never really thought about it.
Well, I think that's the piece that's missing, right? Is one, people don't know about these markdown files, and then two, people don't want to spend the time, specifying the architectural principles and the guidelines and the code quality standards, et cetera, et cetera. They just want to jump in to do like this vibe coding, right? Whatever tool it is, and I think the investment in actually setting up the context is absolutely critical to a successful outcome, right?
I think people who have had bad experiences with vibe coding, uh, it's often because of the lack of setup and preparation for the environment. If you've spent some time developing out your context of what you want the LM to provide, you get a much better experience. And I really am kind of curious about the studies that show that it's like a net negative for development. Um, how much prep has gone into getting things set up so that while you're working, it's paying attention to the best practices, or even not necessarily best practices, your individual practices, your quirks as a developer of what you like. Um, like I know for a long time, there were a lot of things, bad habits I've had using I, J, and K for iterators, and that took a while to break out of it. Um, quantifying out, like writing out the series steps that you should use iterators that make sense, that are more like putting that down as a file and having it do that could be a nice little reminder for me not to use I, J, and K.
Great, Sal. Thanks. That's great information about context engineering, how we set up the context so we can actually do better vibe coding. We're going to take a break and then we'll be back with part 2 on how we actually do vibe coding and some best practices there. Thanks, everyone. Bye.